I have made decisions that altered the course of kingdoms. I have dissolved pacts, reassigned territories, redrawn borders that had stood for a century, always with a calm hand and a clear head, because Caldenmore required it, and because certainty was the one thing I had in abundance. I had been Alpha King for 31 years. I knew what I was doing in every room I entered, on every road I rode, in every judgment I handed down. That knowledge was the ground I stood on, and I had never once felt it shift beneath my feet. I felt it shift on a Tuesday in late autumn, in a village so small it did not appear on any territorial map, when a woman I had never met opened a cottage door and looked at me the way you look at a person you have simply decided to help. Not with recognition, not with awe, not with the careful deference every man and woman in my kingdom gave the moment they understood who was standing in their doorway. She looked at me with the plain, unhurried attention of someone who had seen a cold, tired traveler and had already made up her mind about what to do. That was all it took. My wolf, who had been silent for 30 years, not dormant, not wounded, simply silent, as though waiting for something I had long since stopped believing would come, rose in my chest so suddenly that I reached for the doorframe. She noticed. She said, "You should come in out of the wind." I went in. My name is Aldrich. I am the Alpha King of Caldenmore, the Midlands Wolf Kingdom that stretches from the Marin River in the south to the Grey Heath in the north, from the Chalk Downs in the east to the Old Forest in the west. I have ruled it since I was 24, and I have ruled it alone, and I had decided long ago that this was simply the shape of my life. My wolf had chosen no mate in 31 years of searching. My council had brought me candidates, daughters of powerful alphas, noble omegas of good bloodline, women of intelligence and standing from every corner of the territory. My wolf had been courteous about each of them and absolutely unmoved. After the first decade, I stopped reading the assessments my council prepared. After the second, I stopped apologizing for my wolf's indifference. After the third, I simply told them to leave it alone. The kingdom ran well, that was enough. The matter of Eldwick came to my desk in late summer, a border village in the Western Midlands, unaffiliated with any pack, existing in a kind of administrative gap in the territorial record. No alpha oversight, no pack tithe, no formal acknowledgement of Caldenmore's sovereignty, though the village had sat inside our borders for 100 years by simple geography. It had come to my attention because one of my Western pack lords, a man named Caversham, had written twice in 3 months to inquire what was to be done with it. He was not unkind, Caversham. He simply liked things accounted for. An unaffiliated settlement of 43 people with no pack affiliation was, to his mind, an administrative loose end. The standard resolution for a settlement of that size, that history, and that degree of administrative invisibility was dissolution. A formal document, delivered by a crown rider, noting that the settlement had 30 days to affiliate with an established pack or to disperse. It was not a cruel instrument. In practice, most unaffiliated villages had kin in nearby packs, and the process was a formality. But it required a signed order from the crown, and since I happened to be making a western progress anyway, a routine inspection of 3 pack holds in Caversham's territory, I had decided to ride to Eldwick myself and have a look before I signed anything. I told no one I was coming. I rode with 2 guards who stayed on the road half a mile back, and I went in plain wool, without my seal ring, on an unremarkable brown horse that could have belonged to any merchant or road physician in the Midlands. I wanted to see the village as it was, not as it would arrange itself to appear for a king. I arrived in Eldwick on a grey Tuesday morning in late autumn, when the mist was still sitting in the heather, and the cottages were the color of the stone they were built from. It was a quiet place, a main track, perhaps 24 buildings, a well, a small market square with no market in it, a great old rowan tree with its berries gone to the birds. A few people moved at the edges of the track, none paying me particular attention. children somewhere, their voices muffled by the mist. I rode to the center of the village and dismounted, and I stood for a moment reading the feeling of the place. This was something I had learned to do early, to stand in a location and read it the way you read a fire, looking not at the flames but at what the flames were doing. Eldwick felt quiet, not suppressed, not afraid, simply unhurried. A village that had existed outside the territorial record long enough that it had built its own rhythms and was comfortable in them. The dissolution order was in my saddlebag, unsigned. I was thinking about whether to sign it. I was also, I noted with some detachment, very cold. I had ridden through an hour of mist and my shoulders were damp, and the plain wool was doing almost nothing. It was while I was standing there, cold and thinking about administrative instruments, that the cottage door across the track opened and the woman came out. She was carrying a basket of dried herbs, rosemary, I thought, and something with small dark leaves I didn't immediately identify. She was plainly dressed, a brown overdress over gray linen, her dark hair pinned back and escaping a little at the temples, her boots sensible and worn. She was not young in the way of someone still becoming herself. She had arrived at herself some time ago and was clearly comfortable with what she'd found. She moved with the unhurried assurance of a person who had a good deal to do, and had made reliable peace with that fact. She was crossing the track without looking at me, and then she did look at me, and she stopped. Not because she recognized me. She did not. She stopped because she was reading me the same way I had been reading the village, with a direct, practical attention that took in the damp wool, the tired horse, the cold. "You've come a long way," she said, not a question. "Some distance," I said. "There's no inn." She said it without apology. "There hasn't been since the Weathered family left. If you need shelter, the Having family takes in travelers sometimes, or there's the old tack room behind the Rowan. It's dry, if not much else." "I wasn't looking for shelter," I said. "I was looking to understand the village." She considered this. "Are you with the pack administration?" No, it was technically true. I was the administration, but I was not with it in any formal sense this morning. "Then you're just passing through." "Probably," I said. She nodded, as though this were a reasonable answer to an unreasonable situation, and turned back toward her cottage. And then she stopped again. She stood with her back to me for a moment as though working something out, and then she turned around and said, "Have you eaten?" I had not eaten since before dawn. I had been riding through mist and thinking about dissolution orders. "Not recently," I said. "Come in," she said. "I have bread." Her cottage was small and ordered and warm. There was a fire going, a real fire, well made, with the particular even heat of someone who had been managing fires for years and had strong opinions about it. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the low rafters, rosemary and thyme and yarrow and things I had no name for, their smells layered and dry and clean. A worktable along one wall held small clay pots and a mortar and a collection of glass bottles, some filled and some not. A single window looked out over the mist and the Rowan. A cat, elderly and orange, was asleep on the hearthrug and did not stir for my arrival. She set her basket down and went to a shelf and came back with bread, a round loaf, dark, still faintly warm from the morning. She set it on the table with a clay pot of something that turned out to be a soft cheese with herbs pressed through it, and she poured water from a jug and set that down too, and then she looked at the arrangement for a moment as if checking it against some internal standard, and appeared to find it acceptable. "Sit," she said. I sat. I cannot explain what happened next except to say that it happened slowly and all at once, the way certain things do. I was eating the bread, which was good, a dense, honest bread with the slight sweetness of heather honey, and she was standing at her worktable doing something with a small glass bottle, and I was watching the fire, and my wolf was very, very quiet. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of attention. I had not felt my wolf pay attention like this since I was 20 years old and my first beta had walked into the training yard, and my wolf had said, with absolute clarity, this one. My wolf had a gift for recognition. It had simply, for 30 years, not recognized anyone in this particular way. It recognized her. I became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound you cannot place. Gradually, and then all at once, a warmth at the back of the chest, a certainty with no shape yet, and then I looked down at my left wrist, and I saw that the mark was waking. I have seen bond marks wake before. I have been present at 3 mating ceremonies in my kingdom, and I know what it looks like, a slow brightening under the skin, like light finding its way through stone. I had seen it on the wrists of my betas and my senior lords, and I had watched with something I could not quite name, some careful quiet feeling I had not spent time examining. On my own wrist, in a cottage in Eldwick on a gray Tuesday morning, it looked different. It looked inevitable. The mark rose slowly, a pattern I had carried since birth. The mark all called and more alphas carry, which clarifies and brightens when the bond is real and dims to nothing when it is not. In 31 years it had never done anything at all. Now it was lit from underneath, a steady warm light that intensified as I sat at her table, and my wolf was so still it felt like held breath. I pulled my sleeve down, quickly and quietly. I did not know what I was doing yet, and I did not trust myself to understand it properly in a cold cottage on a Tuesday morning with a woman whose name I did not know. She turned from her work table. "Better," she said, meaning the bread, meaning the warmth, meaning whatever it was that had been visibly wrong with me when I arrived. "Yes," I said, "very much." "Good," she said it simply and went back to her bottles. Her name, I learned over the next half hour of what I can only call careful conversation, her careful and mine less so, because I was still managing a wolf who had decided to feel everything simultaneously, was Marin. She had been the village herbalist for 11 years, since her mother before her had grown too old to manage the work. She supplied remedies to Eldwick and 3 surrounding villages. She had been trained by her mother who had been trained by her grandmother, and she was not affiliated with any pack because her family had never been, and the question had simply never come up in a way that required resolution. "Has anyone from the pack administration ever visited?" I asked, very neutrally. "Once, maybe 12 years ago, a young man with a ledger. He wrote something down and left. Nothing ever came of it." She glanced at me with a calm, lateral attention. "Is that why you're here?" "I'm trying to understand the village," I said, which was still technically true. She seemed to accept this. She said, "Eldwick is a good village. People look after each other. We're small enough that you have to." And the pack affiliation question. If someone came and told us we needed to affiliate, I suppose we would work out what that meant. She said it without alarm, without defensiveness. "It's never seemed urgent to me. We're not causing trouble for anyone." I looked at the sealed dissolution order sitting in my saddlebag on my horse outside and said nothing. I stayed longer than I had intended. She did not seem to find this unusual. She worked at her table while I sat by the fire and drank water and talked about the village, its history, its families, the way the western mist came in off the heath in autumn, and what herbs she grew specifically for the coughs it brought. She talked about her work the way people talk about things they love without knowing they love them, with a matter-of-fact precision that was also, unmistakably, tenderness. My wolf did not move the entire time. It simply attended. The mark on my wrist kept its steady warmth under my sleeve, and I kept my sleeve down, and I sat in the fire heat of a woman's cottage in an unmapped village and tried to think clearly about a decision I had already made without knowing it. When I rose to leave, she walked me to the door. The mist outside had thinned slightly. The orange cat had relocated from the hearthrug to the windowsill and was observing the rowan tree with professional detachment. "Thank you for the bread," I said. "I should tell you I may return." She looked at me with the same direct, unhurried attention she had given me at the beginning. "All right," she said. "The bread will be better if you give me notice. I used the last of this loaf for you." I had eaten her last bread. She had given it to me without hesitation, to a cold stranger she had never seen before, and she had mentioned it only now and only as practical information. I rode back down the track to where my guards were waiting, and I did not open my saddlebag. The dissolution order stayed unsigned. I returned to Caversham's hold, and I said nothing about Eldwick for 5 days. This was unusual for me. I am not, by nature or by practice, a man who withholds information from his senior counsel or lets decisions sit unresolved. Decisiveness is the currency of good governance. Uncertainty is expensive, and I have always tried to spend it quickly. But this was not uncertainty. This was something else entirely. I spent the 5 days conducting the planned inspection of Caversham's 3 holds, and I did it with my full attention, reviewing accounts, receiving reports, conducting the usual interviews with pack officers and senior omegas and border wardens. I was not distracted in any way that would have been visible to an observer. But underneath all of it, my wolf was doing something it had not done in 30 years. It was oriented, like a compass finding north, like a held breath waiting. The bond mark on my wrist had not dimmed. It sat there, warm and certain, under my sleeve, and on the 3rd evening when I finally pushed my sleeve up and looked at it properly in the light of the fire in my guest chamber at Caversham's hall, I saw that it had deepened, the pattern sharper, the light more settled, as though it had been waking incrementally and had now decided on its final form. I had read in the old records that a bond mark waking on an Alpha King's wrist was considered one of the clearest signs in Caldenmore's legal tradition. The Crown's bond mark was not decorative. It was a record, a living record, carried in the body of the king's nature. The scholars who had written about it described the waking as unmistakable, not a flicker, not a suggestion, but a declaration. The mark does not mistake itself, one old record said, with a dryness I had always found faintly amusing. It has had longer to consider the matter than the king has. I pushed my sleeve back down and sat with the fire for a long time. Then I called for Caversham. He came quickly. He was a careful man who understood the weight of a late summons from the Alpha King. He was a tall man of about 50, lean and deliberate, with the kind of face that listened well. I had trusted him for 20 years, and I trusted him now. "Eldwick," I said, "tell me what you know of it." He sat down across from me and told me what I had already mostly gathered, the history, the administrative gap, the question of affiliation. He was careful and thorough, and I could tell he was trying to read why I was asking. "The dissolution order," he said at the end. "You haven't returned it to me." "No." "Is there a reason?" I thought about how to answer this. "There's a question of house affiliation," I said finally. "There's a woman in the village, a herbalist, unaffiliated family, long-standing. If the village affiliates rather than dissolves, her situation would need to be formalized." Caversham regarded me for a long moment. He was a careful man, not a quick man, but he was also a man who had known me for 20 years and had watched me handle very complicated situations very smoothly. He knew when something was not routine. "I see," he said. "I'll return to Eldwick," I said. "I'll resolve it directly." "Of course," Caversham said. He said it without inflection, which was how he said things he understood better than he was going to let on. "Shall I send word ahead?" "No," I said. "I'll go as I came." He nodded. He did not say anything else, but as he rose to leave, he paused at the door and said, very carefully, "My lord, the bond law is clear on the matter of the Crown's mark. It takes precedence over administrative instruments." I looked at him. "I'm simply noting it," he said, "for clarity." "Good night, Caversham," I said. He left, but there was something, the smallest shift in his bearing before the door closed, that told me he was not displeased. I rode back to Eldwick on the 7th day after my first visit, And this time I went in the morning with the mist still on the heath, the same brown horse and the same plain wool, and I left my guards even further back on the road. I knew I was not being sensible about this. I knew the proper course was to return as the Alpha King, formally, with documentation and a council rider, and a clear statement of what I intended. I knew it and I did not do it, because something in me needed to stand in that cottage again first, in that warmth, with that woman who had given me her last bread without knowing who I was, and understand what had happened before I made it official. She was in her garden when I arrived. A small garden along the south wall of the cottage, winter-stripped but still carrying some late-growth kale, she told me later, and two varieties of something I still cannot name. She was crouching in the cold, her hands in the earth, and she looked up when she heard my horse. She recognized me. Her face did the small readjustment it does when a person who was merely an unexpected visitor the first time is now an unexpected visitor again, and the nature of the surprise shifts. "You came back," she said. I said I might. She stood wiping her hands on her apron. "I have better bread today. I made it this morning." I had been king for 31 years. I had sat in judgment over territorial disputes and succession questions and treaty negotiations, and the kind of complex legal matters that require two kinds of patience and one kind of ruthlessness. I had never in my adult life been disarmed by bread. "Thank you," I said. We went inside. The fire was going. The cat was in the same spot on the hearthrug. I had the brief thought that it had simply not moved in 7 days, which seemed entirely plausible. The herbs in the rafters were the same, or similar. She had taken down some bundles and hung new ones, and the smell was slightly different, a thread of something sharper and greener running through the dry warmth. She made tea. She did not ask why I had come back. She brought the tea and the bread, and she sat across the table from me and said, with her characteristic directness, "You're not a traveling merchant." "No," I said. "And you're not a road physician." "No." "What are you, then?" I had been considering on the ride over how to answer this question. There was a right order to things, and the right order was mark first, then name. "Before I tell you," I said, "I need to show you something." I pulled back my left sleeve. The bond mark was fully woken now, sharper and deeper than it had been on the first visit, the pattern complete, the light settled and warm and absolutely unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. And she was a herbalist from an unaffiliated family, so she might not know what she was looking at all. She leaned forward and looked at my wrist. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she said very carefully, "That looks like a bond mark." "It is. I've seen the alpha of the nearest pack's bonded mark once from a distance. It didn't look like that." "Mine is different," I said. "It's the crown's mark. It carries differently." She was very still, looking at my wrist. Then she looked up at me. "Why are you showing me?" "Because it was not lit before I came here the first time," I said. "In 31 years. And within an hour of arriving in this village it woke." She sat with that for a moment. I could see her reading it, the same direct, practical intelligence she had brought to everything else, now turned on something that was considerably outside the ordinary. "That's not," she stopped, started again. "That doesn't happen randomly." "No," I said, "it does not." Another silence. The fire settled. The cat shifted on the hearthrug. Outside, a bird in the rowan tree said something brief and unintelligible. "I should check something," she said. She said it the way she said everything, without alarm, with a kind of careful matter-of-factness that I was beginning to understand was simply the shape of her mind. She pushed up her own left sleeve. I looked. On her wrist, faint but there, brightening even as I watched, was the mirror mark. The pattern that belonged to the Alpha King's fated mate had been there all her life, waiting to recognize the right wrist. And now it was waking, the light rising slowly under her skin like dawn coming in through stone. She stared at it for a long moment. I've always had this, she said. My mother said it was just a birthmark. It's not a birthmark, I said. No, she agreed. She said it slowly, reading the mark on her own wrist as it continued to brighten. It's not. She looked up at me. Her face was doing something I had not seen before, not afraid, not overwhelmed, not joyful yet, simply very present, very attentive, as though she were taking in a piece of information that was large and real, and required the same careful attention she gave everything else in her life. Who are you? She said. Aldrich, I said, Alpha King of Caldenmore. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock, exactly. It was the silence of a person putting things in order, the administrative stranger who had asked about pack affiliation, the dissolution order he hadn't mentioned, the crown bond mark on his wrist, the mirror mark that had apparently been on her wrist her entire life, without anyone knowing what it was. You came here about the village, she said. Yes. About whether to dissolve it. Yes. She looked at the marks, mine, then hers, then mine again. Then she said, with a dryness that was so perfect I nearly laughed, and now? Now, I said, I have a different document to sign. I am not a man who does things informally. I am the Alpha King of Caldenmore, and when the crown's bond mark wakes and the mirror mark is found, there is a process, an old one, well documented in the legal tradition, clear in its requirements. 2 council witnesses to observe the mark settling into full recognition, a formal statement by the Alpha King, a naming of the mate before witnesses, documentation filed with the Crown Record. It should by rights have happened at the Great Hall in Caldenmore's capital, with full council present, with ceremony and regalia and all the formal weight the event carried. It did not happen that way, because Marin said, quietly but without any apparent doubt about the matter, I would like it to happen here. We were still sitting at her table. The marks on both our wrists were fully settled by then, the light deep and steady and warm, the patterns complete and clear, the bond between them as obvious as architecture. My wolf was not silent anymore. It was simply calm in a way it had never been before, the calm of a thing that has arrived somewhere it was always going. Eldwick, I said, if it can be done here. It can be done anywhere I choose to do it, I said. The bond law is the Crown's law. It follows me. She nodded as though this were perfectly reasonable, and I suppose, to her mind, it was. She was a practical woman. She had asked what she needed to know. She had looked at what there was to see, and she had decided what she wanted. And what she wanted was to be named in her own village, in the gray hall she knew, before the people who had known her all her life. I understood this completely. I sent for Caversham, a rider back down the road to the hold, with a note that was 6 words long. I sent a second rider north for Lord Having, who governed the neighboring territory and whom I knew to be already traveling in this part of the country. And I asked Marin if there was a hall in Eldwick, and she said there was, the old gray building at the north end of the track that the village used for meetings, and I said that would do. She went back into her garden while we waited, and I sat in the doorway of her cottage in the pale autumn light, and my wolf sat with me, not pacing, not restless, simply there, oriented, finished with the search. Caversham arrived in the late afternoon, with 2 of his senior officers and the necessary documentation already prepared, because Caversham was a man who had been expecting this for 6 days and had spent the time getting the paperwork in order. He took in the marks on our wrists with the expression of a man who had been quietly right about something for a long time and had the decency not to say so too visibly. Bond law proceedings, he said. At your word, my lord. At my word, I said. The village hall. Having arrived an hour later on a fast horse, wind-blown and in excellent humor, he looked at the marks, looked at Marin, looked at me, and said, with a warmth he didn't bother to restrain, well. And then, about time, if you don't mind my saying. I did not particularly mind. The Great Hall of Eldwick was not great in any sense that a visiting dignitary would recognize. It was a low stone building, old and clean and solid, lit by 6 hanging lanterns and a fire at each end, with wooden benches along the walls and a stone floor that had been swept recently. It held 41 people, every adult in the village who could be gathered in the time available, which was all of them, because in a village of 43 souls word travels at the speed of someone opening a door and calling to their neighbor. They came without knowing precisely what they were coming to. They came because their village was being called together, and the village always came when it was called. They came because Marin had been among them for 11 years, and the word had gone around that this was something to do with her. And in Eldwick, when something was to do with Marin, people showed up. I stood at the front of the hall with Caversham on my left and Having on my right, and I had taken off the plain wool coat and put on the one Caversham's man had brought, dark, formal, the crown's crest at the collar. Not full regalia, but enough. Marin walked in from the side door, and she had done something with her hair, pinned it more carefully, replaced the worn apron with a clean, dark overdress that was simple and good and suited her perfectly. She looked exactly like herself, which was what she had always looked like and was apparently all she needed to look like. She stood beside me, and she looked out at the 41 people in the lantern-lit hall without any visible uncertainty. I pulled back my left sleeve. Caversham said, in the formal voice he used for crown proceedings, the Alpha King's bond mark, settled in full recognition. He said it to the hall, as the proceedings required, a witness naming what was being witnessed. I took Marin's left hand and pushed back her sleeve. Having said the mirror mark settled in full recognition, he leaned in slightly to look, and I could see him reading the marks with a care that was genuine, not ceremonial. Both marks settled, he said, both clear. The bond is real and complete. He looked at me. I said, I am Aldrich, Alpha King of Caldenmore. The bond law of the crown recognizes Marin of Eldwick as my fated mate. I name her before these witnesses. I claim her as my Luna, and as the future Queen of Caldenmore, with all the rights and protections the bond law provides. I looked at Marin. She looked back at me with the same direct, unhurried attention she had given me at every moment since I had first arrived at her door, cold and uncertain, on a gray Tuesday morning, with an unsigned dissolution order in my saddlebag. Yes, she said, quietly and without any doubt at all. The hall was very still, not the silence of shock, the silence of something landing, something large and real, recognized by 41 people at once. Then the woman nearest the front. I learned later she was the weaver, Marin's neighbor of 10 years, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was precisely the sound a person makes when they understand that something wonderful has happened, and they do not have a better response than that. And the hall gently came alive. There are things I did afterward that I should document, because they were the practical consequences of a decision that carried considerable practical weight. The dissolution order was not signed. It was formally voided. A document returned to the Crown Record as rescinded, on the grounds that the Alpha King had found the unaffiliated settlement to be operating under the bond law's provisions, which superseded the administrative instrument. Caversham filed the paperwork with his characteristic thoroughness and his characteristic absence of commentary. Eldwick's affiliation was formalized not as a dissolution but as a direct charter, a village under the Crown's direct acknowledgement, removed from the administrative gap it had occupied for a century, its inhabitants protected under Crown law. It was an unusual instrument. Having said, with the warmth he brought to most things, that it was the first Crown charter granted to a settlement of 43 people in living memory, and that this spoke well of the village, and perhaps less well of Caldenmore's historical record-keeping. Caversham said, from somewhere near the back of the hall, that he had opinions about the record-keeping. Marin listened to all of this with her characteristic attention, and asked 3 precise questions about what the charter meant in practical terms for the people she supplied with remedies, and whether it changed their obligations in any way. And when Caversham confirmed it did not change them adversely, she nodded and appeared satisfied. She came to Caldenmore in the spring. I had spent the winter making the journey to Eldwick rather than requiring the reverse, partly because the capital in winter was no place to ask someone to suddenly inhabit, and partly because there was a great deal of work I could do from Caversham's hold, and partly because I found that the ride through the Midlands missed to a small cottage with a fire going, and an elderly orange cat on the hearthrug had become, very quickly, the part of my days I valued most. She was not changed by the winter. That is what I noticed most over those months, that she did not adjust herself to the fact of who I was in the ways I had seen people adjust themselves, the careful recalibration of manner and speech and bearing that happened when ordinary life suddenly acquired a king in it. She remained exactly as she had been the first morning, direct, unhurried, practical, generous without calculation. She asked me questions about governance that were sometimes more incisive than the questions my counsel asked, because she had no stake in the answers other than genuine interest. She told me when she thought I was wrong twice and was right both times. She fed me very good bread. My wolf, for the first time in 30 years, was not oriented toward something absent. It was simply there, present in a way it had never been. I had not understood before how much of my energy had gone into managing its silence. With that silence gone, I had more of myself available than I had known was missing. The spring progress to Caldenmore was formal, a journey with full escort, proper documentation, a staged arrival at the capital that Caversham had organized with his usual precise care. The council had been informed. The bond was a matter of public record. There was ceremony waiting, the full naming ceremony, the presentation before the full council, the traditional reception that Caldenmore had not had occasion to stage in 31 years. Marin stood in my council hall in a gown the color of gray heather, and received the formal acknowledgment of the crown's senior lords with the same unhurried directness she had brought to everything else in her life. She did not perform composure. She was simply composed, in the way of someone who had a clear sense of what they were doing, and had no particular concern about whether observers found it impressive. Having was there and greeted her like an old friend, which he had already become through the winter. Caversham was there, and bowed with the precision and warmth of a man who had been waiting for this outcome longer than the Alpha King had, and was glad to see it arrive. The other lords and their senior officers received her in their turn, and if there were any who had opinions about the circumstances, a herbalist from an unmapped village, an unaffiliated family, no pack, no rank, they did not voice those opinions in the room, because the bond mark on the Alpha King's wrist was visible to anyone who looked, and the bond law was unambiguous. In the evening, when the formal reception was done, and the hall had emptied to the senior staff, and the fire had burned low and warm, I found Marin standing at the window that looked north over the capital's rooftops toward the dark line of the moor. "Well," she said, the way she said things, as though taking account of a situation and finding it navigable. "Well," I said. She turned from the window and looked at me, and her face had the small private quality it had in her cottage on ordinary mornings, when no one was watching and she was just herself, reading something at the table or working at the herb bench with the cat at her feet. "I gave you my last bread," she said, "and look what happened." "Yes," I said. "I'm going to need to make more bread," she said. "There's no heather honey in this city." I looked. "I'll find some," I said. She nodded, satisfied. "Good." And she turned back to the window, and I stood beside her, and we looked out over Caldenmore together in the quiet, the city spread below us, the moor in the distance, the night coming in off the heath. My wolf was still, my mark was warm. My queen was thinking about honey, and about the village she had come from, and about what bread she was going to make in a capital city, she had arrived in 6 hours ago and already appeared to have decided she could manage. I had gone to Eldwick to extinguish a light. The light had given me bread and let me sit by its fire, and it turned out to have been the only thing in 31 years that could see me clearly. I did not put that in any official document. It is not the kind of thing that goes in official documents. But it is the truest account I have of how Caldenmore got its queen, not through a ceremony I arranged or a candidate my council selected or a plan anyone made, but through a cold Tuesday morning and a last loaf, and a woman who simply looked at a tired stranger and decided to be kind. She still is, every day, without effort, and every day my wolf settles into the same unhurried warmth that found it first in a cottage in Eldwick, and is at home,